in collaboration with students at the University of Puerto Rico to identify lessons learned from Hurricane Maria in order to inform planning efforts both in Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And Hurricane Maria was taken as this sort of worst case scenario for what could happen in order for Hawaii, which is another set of islands, could better understand what it might need to prepare its citizens for and its residents for in case a similar event happened. And so that's the preparedness example. And in disaster response, which is a much more rapid pace sort of aspect of disaster management, I'll give an example from my work with the Pacific Disaster Center. And so if you're not familiar with what PDC does, the website is pdc.org. And one of the services that the organization provides is its platform Disaster Aware. And it is a decision support platform or an early warning platform that draws in data from over 400 different resources. And if you imagine a Google Maps sort of platform where you can pull up where all of the hurricanes in the world are happening, all of the wildfires, all of the earthquakes, and all of the landslides and floods and droughts, and additional layers for vulnerable populations and infrastructure and anything else that a decision maker might need in order to decide, well, we need to move this population and evacuate people from here because it's going to flood, because there's going to be storm surge. So what PDC does is to respond to disasters by providing these decision support products that will give you data visualizations and insights as to how many elderly would be affected and how many children, what percentage of an urban population versus rural, and how much land would be impacted, as well as a bunch of maps that would be useful in an emergency operations center. And so during big hurricane events, for example, our response team would activate and be on call essentially to watch for different advisories and run models to put together this data and send to partners in different countries that would be impacted, as well as partners in the Department of Defense, so they can take swift action. And then finally, for the recovery side of things, this is trickier because recovery tends to be much longer term than any of the other phases, arguably. After a place has been impacted by a disaster, recovery can take anywhere from a year to 30 years, if not more, as I'm sure you all are aware. And the example that I'll use that I was a part of was the US Virgin Islands after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. I had the privilege of going down to do a disaster reconnaissance mission with a National Science Foundation funded group called SURGE, Scholars and Underrepresented Groups in Engineering and Social Sciences. And we were able to participate in damage assessments with local groups on the ground in partnership with the University of Virgin Islands. And this ranged from looking at building damages to flood, as well as debris that had washed into the ocean, to mangrove forests being damaged. And our group essentially went from sector to sector, trying to add capacity to local groups already doing this work on the ground, and devised some interventions that we then came back the following year to implement to address some of the issues that we were able to identify, from food security to water and infrastructure mapping, as well as replanting some mangroves, and just a range of other sorts of activities.
Wow, amazing experiences, Lily. Absolutely extraordinary. And really, different types of emergencies from small to large. And as you say, those, thinking about those impacts and those, the recovery periods as well. What do you think about volunteering and volunteerism? How do you see that as evolving in emergencies?
Yeah, I spoke with Lisa about this when we were prepping for this chat, and um, I know that volunteers are, I'll say, force multipliers to existing emergency management staff, whose full-time job it is to be doing either preparedness response or recovery. And they are really the engine of disaster work, especially after and even before and during events. A lot of NGOs that work in this space depend on volunteers as people on the ground, as well as they lean on volunteer groups to understand what are the needs of the community, as well as to identify what community leaders are there in order to be sensitive to the needs of those who have been impacted. And for example, in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, I feel like I can speak more with more familiarity with this example because it was the crux of my doctoral research. After Hurricane Maria hit, volunteers from all over the island banded together before responders were able to even arrive in places that had been hit, in order to ensure that families had food and water, and if they didn't have electricity, then to share resources as needed. And this is the kind of work that we would hope is possible, or this is the kind of work that preparedness aims for communities. And it's the greatest wish of anyone working in disaster risk reduction that even before the professionals arrive, people are able to take care of themselves. It's not the most ideal situation, especially for very isolated communities, but having additional capacity and having that knowledge of what to do and to understand one's own risk is something that people in the field truly aim for. And so I think that, you know, in short, volunteerism really represents the kindness of strangers, and that is really what drives a lot of recovery work in this field.
I couldn't agree with you more, Lily, and certainly our experiences in Australia are so often that it is non-government organisations, community organisations, volunteering groups that really band together as soon as an emergency event occurs to provide that immediate relief and support to people that have been impacted. And then importantly, they provide that longer term support right throughout that recovery period. And the great thing about those volunteers is that they're local. They know and understand their communities. They know that community's strengths and what can be enhanced and supported, and also can really identify what those communities' needs might be and help advocate for those needs. As well. So, I think they're really underappreciated and under-acknowledged sort of in the broader emergency management system, if you like, and certainly with informal emergency management arrangements.
Right.
So, another question I wanted to ask was probably a little bit more about yourself. And one of those questions is, how do you keep a healthy work-life balance? And of course, we've all had to face this and talk about this, but you know, even pre-COVID and certainly during COVID, how is it that you balance your life and your work?
Yes, thank you for this question. It's tricky too, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir by saying that burnout is real, especially during COVID, and especially as an emergency manager or someone working in a field where you're faced daily with this sensation that, you know, if I'm not doing my job, then it could potentially put someone else at risk, or it means that, you know, if I don't respond to this request for information during this hurricane event, it could impact somebody down the line. And, you know, there's an extreme sense of responsibility in our field, and it leads to that burnout. But I do think that I'm noticing a shift towards valuing and leveraging mental health resources within organizations and universities particularly. And especially during COVID, I think all of us who have had to deal with working remotely and working from home, and understanding that there is such a thin boundary between, you know, using your computer for work versus your personal time, and just not being able to step away. It just gets harder and harder with that work from home environment. At least for myself, I think I have, during hurricane season of last year, when I was glued to my computer because of these double hurricane events that we were responding to, I made it a point to step outside and to ensure that I was away from my computer for at least a few times a day. I also made it a point to actually use my sick and vacation time, which I think some of us have, you know, some trouble justifying. At least it might be a function of the culture of the States, but there's this very prevalent mentality of, you know, just valuing your work so much that there's almost a sense of guilt that comes with taking vacation. But especially in this field, I think it's so important to recharge and take care of oneself in order to come back to work refreshed and rejuvenated enough to do the hard work. And so, I mean, what I hope to see more in the field in general is to continue to advance this culture of self-care in order to be able to bring the best of ourselves to the table, even if it's, you know, even if it's a high pressure sort of environment that enables this burnout that we often see.
Couldn't agree with you more, Lily. There's been quite a focus on the mental health and well-being of first responders here in Australia, which has been really welcome, obviously, with first responders often having to deal with really traumatic events and the impact that it has on them, and then by extension, of course, their families and even their local communities. And it's an incredibly welcome advancement. And I think here in Victoria as well, we had a Royal Commission into mental health recently, which has really brought to the fore, I think, the importance of talking about mental health and well-being, about destigmatizing mental health, and ensuring that, as you say, you do take time to look after yourself so that, you know, when you do turn up to work, you can perform at your best and be your best. But none of us can do that without taking care of ourselves.
Absolutely.
And Lily, what about, what do you read? What do you watch? What do you listen to? How do you escape?
Well, originally when I spoke to Lisa about this question, it was about resources for emergency management. So I'll start with those, but I will also share what else I've been reading and listening to, you know, for leisure. So just for everyone's reference, perhaps during, or not during, but as reference for this field and additional resources that might be helpful, that I would highly recommend looking at the Hazard Center website. I do think fondly of this because that is how Lisa and I originally connected. And it's such a huge community of researchers and practitioners who are in this field. And there's a blog that features a lot of writing from people within the Hazard Center community. It is based in the US, but there are a lot of members within its community that are international. And it is based at the University of Colorado in Boulder and hosts a conference every single year. It's actually going on this year, and features, I would say, the best of the best scholars and researchers and practitioners sharing their work and talking about things like mental health and social justice and just memorials to other disaster scholars who have passed on. You know, I can just think of so many different topics that this conference covers that it almost, you know, it's almost, I laugh at this analogy, but it is what it feels like when you go to this conference. It's almost like going to church and like just hearing a lot of the work that we tend to do as disaster managers and emergency managers. And it's very affirming to be part of this community. There are very many like-minded people who share the same ethos of doing good work. And that's something I value very much about the Hazard Center. And some others that I'll point to are the International Association of Emergency Managers and the Disaster Recovery Institute International, DRI. And these are great resources for trainings and other things that have to do with our field. And they're worth just clicking around. And in terms of what I've been listening to lately, I did just go on a very long road trip with my family this past week. We drove through a lot of the desert in the southwest of the United States, and I listened to quite a bit of old school Motown, a lot of the Jackson 5, and it was really great to be on the road and listen to a lot of that, a lot of the music from that era.
That sounds like an awful lot of fun, Lily. I can just imagine you boogieing away in the car with your family to Motown through the desert. It sounds very exotic and very exciting to us sitting at home. Thank you. I'm going to open up for questions now. I'm really keen for people who are attending today to take advantage of this opportunity to ask Lily almost anything really about her experiences, her research, her expertise and background. Who would like to go first? Come on, I know.
A question in the chat from Jennifer. Let me just read this out loud. So with volunteers, New Zealand is currently reviewing emergency management legislation, including applying consideration to volunteers. Liability keeps coming up as an excuse to not use volunteers or to support or develop volunteers or plan for the use of particularly spontaneous volunteers. I imagine this is a barrier in the US as well. Are you aware of well-developed best practices or best practice legislative or planning arrangements that enable volunteer support and US in response? Yeah, this is very tricky. And Jennifer, did you want to add anything to this question after I've read it? I don't see your name here.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer.
You know, I am not aware of any explicit policies about volunteers, but I'm happy to continue looking into this for you and share it with the group. My experience with volunteers is usually through the American Red Cross, and they do have certain protections for volunteers through them. There's actually quite a formal process that comes with becoming a volunteer for the Red Cross. It's almost like applying to a job. But I'm very happy to continue looking further into this and to share back with Lisa or Bridget.
Thanks, Lily. That would be great. And look, certainly here in Australia or in Victoria anyway, the issue of spontaneous volunteers has, you know, gone around a whole lot of different cycles of, you know, what do we do with them? Do we ignore them and tell them to go away? Or do we harness the goodwill, the capacity and the skills that volunteers bring? And from my perspective and working at the Victorian Council of Social Service, we're the peak body for the community sector, and Volunteering Victoria is one of our members. I guess there are a couple of things with regard to spontaneous volunteers, and one of those things is, you know, how do you harness and capture those opportunities with volunteers well before an emergency, so that you've got them in place and you can have them sort of stand up and become activated if and when you need them. And obviously with organisations like Red Cross, you know, very highly experienced in having great tranches of volunteers ready, willing and able to be activated as required. With other volunteers in other areas, some of the most effective ways that we know that they can work is for volunteering hubs to exist within communities. So within a region or an area, there's actually a volunteering centre where people can go and put their names down to say, look, I'm interested in volunteering either on a regular basis or on an irregular basis. Here are my skills, here are my qualifications. You can vet me well beforehand. And then as opportunities arise, those volunteers can be called upon. So those regional kind of hub models, if you like, for volunteering can work really effectively. Another way that we've done it here in Victoria is to establish a portal specifically for emergency events, where volunteers who are interested in participating and contributing to relief or recovery efforts are encouraged to register on that portal. They're then vetted and sort of channelled off to particular organisations or areas where they can be of best use. So thank you. Do we have another question from anybody? Isabel, thank you.
Yeah, I've got one that's sort of probably a bit of a personal question with my sort of circumstance. So I'm doing a PhD at the moment and I'm coming towards the end of it. And I was wondering about your experience with transitioning from doing the PhD into industry and into sort of more practitioner work, and how you sort of, I guess, sold yourself and that kind of process.
Yes, thank you for the question, Isabel. And I'm rooting for you. I know what a long haul a PhD can be. So good on you. You're almost there. I wish you the best of luck with finishing your dissertation and your studies. The transition period was actually very tricky, given that I had finished my PhD right before everything shut down, actually. And so when I began my job search, there was quite a bit of uncertainty as to whether there would be hiring freezes in universities, because there had been, tenure track assistant professorships that had been opened up, but because of all the uncertainty, there were actually a couple examples where I had applied where the committee got back to me and said, actually, we are not hiring for this position anymore. And we invite you to apply again, in the future, if we do open this line back up. So that was a bit discouraging. And I imagine that as things begin to open up, that will be less and less so the case for PhDs coming into the market. But the best advice that I can give is to keep your options open. I'm not sure if you yourself are set on an academic trajectory or are open to something that's in between or something that is strictly practice. But one of the encouraging things about our field is that we have options career-wise across the entire board. And so what I found for myself, at least, is that I'm most comfortable in those in-between sorts of positions where there is an applied research aspect. So, and I think that's very amenable to the field because it's so interdisciplinary and so hands-on that positions where research informs how things should be done in practice or how processes or policies should be implemented, I think are things that I find that I'm most attracted to. But of course, there are so many types of jobs within NGOs and government positions in the US at the federal, the state, and the local level that need people just like you to bring your subject matter expertise, whether it's in early warning or preparedness or recovery or something else entirely to the table. So I think that keeping your options open is something that is good to do, but also, understanding what specific skills you have that are transferable beyond, the very, very niche thing that you are probably studying for your dissertation, and expanding that to understand where it can apply to different situations and different types of positions.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
And it's an absolutely terrific question, Isabel, and it's a question that comes up not specifically relating necessarily to PhDs, but, for people that have done, training or education and are keen to get into the practice field, into an organisation, and, how do they get that first foot in the door, and what is it they can do, and what are the skills they might need. Stepping out of academia into the rest of the world is a really big step, and we wish you all the best, Isabel. Keep us updated on your journey. Questions? Any more questions? Okay, that's all right. I've got some questions I can ask while the rest of you have a think. So thinking, I guess, relating to Isabel's question, what do you think the role of tertiary education in emergency management is, and is it evolving?
Yeah, I like this question a lot. And it's a nice follow-up to Isabel's question, about the academic track and transitioning from that into practice. So what I've seen a lot is that tertiary education becomes a pipeline into building a greater workforce for the field. And I think that is the greatest thing that it can do. And this is not just speaking from the US perspective, but at the Pacific Disaster Center, I was involved in several assessments called the NDPBA, and that's the National Disaster Preparedness Baseline Assessment, which occurs at the country level. And what we find in countries like Panama and Trinidad and Tobago and a host of others is that national disaster management organizations, or NDMOs, struggle with turnover a lot of the time, not necessarily because of lack of interest in the work, but lack of a budget and lack of a clear pipeline into that profession. And so what has happened over the past decade or so, as internationally nations focus on things like sustainable development goals and implementing the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, is there's this understanding collectively that we need better education for this field and people who are trained in order to understand from a theoretical standpoint and also a practical standpoint what it means to be a part of it and to contribute to the field when a disaster occurs, and to build that workforce so that there's less turnover and there's more leadership at the local and the regional and the national level. So I think that tertiary education plays such an important role, and there are more and more disaster certificate programs that are popping up in the States. And I also know that there are more and more people who are finding intersections of this field with other disciplines like geography and urban studies and planning and architecture, and not just policy. So I do think that as we keep an eye on the future of climate security and human security, it's going to become even more relevant to have more scholars in this field and practitioners in this field, because every bit of it counts, let's just say, and we need a multidisciplinary approach to reducing risk.
Fantastic answer, Lily. Absolutely fabulous. Given that we're a women's organisation, and given that we're all women here today, how do you think women are represented in emergency management tertiary education?
I did pull some numbers before our talk because I knew that this question was part of our roster, and I am still so sad to say that we're severely underrepresented in the field. And this is just from the International Association of Emergency Managers. But a study from, let me see, it was 2015. So this is kind of old data, but I just wanted something to start off with. IAEM is 79% male and 21% female. And that is a professional organization, so that doesn't really represent the tertiary education. And I don't have numbers for that, but I do sense that it would be very similar in terms of the split. And that's all to say that we could be doing so much better in terms of bringing women into the field. And historically, I think this field has mostly focused on disaster response. And so, most of the work was sending someone to the ground after a disaster has hit. And for one reason or another, women have not been represented well in those roles. And as we become more holistic in our approach to reducing disaster risk and think more about preparedness and recovery and those long-term sorts of issues, I do find that at least at the national conferences and at least the personal conversations that I have with people who are interested in entering this field, I'm optimistic about how many more women are able to bring their disciplines to the table or to display interest in advancing this field. And the fact that this group exists is also very encouraging. And I will say also that there is a big push for an agenda called Women, Peace, and Security that comes from the US but has an international perspective and affects the Asia Pacific region, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, and the North American countries, to build more capacity and women's leadership in both security and disaster risk reduction. And this begins with understanding and measuring where gender inequality and gender empowerment exists, and finding a way to rank countries based on where there is more need for an intervention and capacity building programs there. So I do find that there's so much more attention being paid to gender And part of that is being more cognizant as researchers and emergency managers or anyone who's working in policy and has access to data to understand how important it is to have sex disaggregated data to be able to understand where those gaps are. And as we move forward with that agenda, to not be so binary with that, but to understand, you know, what other genders are represented, and to understand how to best represent that from a research perspective and a practitioner's perspective, and accounting for that sort of thing in the field.
That's fantastic, Lily. When we first established the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network, we figured that there'd be a similar network in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in the UK, and that we'd all be able to join a sisterhood, if you like, an international sisterhood. And I think we were really surprised to find that there weren't these organisations in place. And I think it does really go back to reflecting you know, this perception that emergency management is lights and sirens, is very much based on response, people in uniform, you know, and first responders. And I like to hope that our network in our own small way is really broadening that concept of what emergency management is, and who plays a part in it, and who contributes what to it. We've got another question here from Dorothy, who said, in line with your current comments, as someone still relatively new to emergency management, around 2 years working in an emergency management service, who also has a non-traditional background in international government relations and sociology, and has then worked in education inclusion and NGOs, what advice do you have in terms of trying to bridge some of the knowledge gaps in our field and the occasional or less than occasional experience of imposter syndrome?
Thank you so much for the question, Dorothy. I appreciate it very much. And I'm very impressed with your background. And it seems like you are also a unicorn in terms of the different disciplines you bring to the table to our field. The best advice that I can think of right now to address bridging gaps and imposter syndrome, which I'm very familiar with, by the way, personally, is to, and I know this sounds quite cheesy probably, but to continue being a lifelong student and to understand and accept off the bat that as an emergency manager, you will not know everything. And sometimes it might feel as though you are expected to, especially if, you know, you're responding to something or in the field, in a recovery team meeting with local community leaders, and you're being asked like, well, what do you think we should do here? You know, sometimes we're called upon to become those experts, even if we don't feel like those experts. And part of this is just, you know, believing in the expertise you already have, but if you do not know the answer, to understand that someone else likely has it, and to believe in how collaborative this field can be, and to find that community leader or that researcher or somebody else who does know the answer, and work together with them to build that expertise and to work towards the best possible solution. And I do think that the more diverse background you can bring to the table, both to the actual physical field after a disaster and to the field of disaster risk reduction, all the better. Because like I said before, we do need as many perspectives as possible to be inclusive in our approach to reducing disaster risk, because we are spending so much more effort trying to understand the impacts of gender and race and all these other factors on how people experience risk. And so someone with your background in both, it sounds like government relations and, you know, sociology, and understanding these wider patterns and systems can only be beneficial. So don't doubt that you have so much already to bring to the table. And that goes for anyone else on this call, to bring all of yourselves to the field. And it can only be a beneficial thing.
Fantastic answer, and I quite agree with you and Dorothy to bring what you've learnt over the past years and your past careers and bring it into wherever you are now. Don't be afraid to speak up and share in your knowledge and insights, because the more connections we can make, the stronger our emergency systems and responses will be. I'll share something that my mother said to me many years ago when I had my first senior role, and I said to her, I just feel like I'm flying by the seat of my pants. And she said, I'll let you in on a secret, Bridget. Everyone is flying by the seat of their pants. And just knowing that, you know, even the most senior people in the room may sometimes have doubts or things they don't know, and they actually look elsewhere to expertise and for answers, just made me feel a whole lot better and sort of put everyone on a similar playing field. Any more questions for Lily? Come on, Chris or Loretta. There must be something you want to ask Lily with her amazing background.
There's no pressure either.
I just wish I was in Hawaii right now rather than in cold Melbourne. So, you know.
Oh, goodness. I'll try to send some sunshine your way.
Thanks, Loretta. Good comment. Lily, I'll just open it up to you. What else would you like to share with us? Are there questions you'd like to ask of any of the women members here about our experiences, about you know, what we see here in Australia and in New Zealand and more broadly?
Yeah, I'm thankful for the opportunity to ask questions back. So I'm curious about what are some of the more pressing challenges that you've perhaps heard of or experienced in the field in terms of developing capacity in emergency management? Is it, you know, perhaps a need for more training and education? And if so, in what areas in particular? Or just if anyone has any stories of just different challenges that the profession is facing and could be improved, I'd be curious to know what you're observing from where you sit.
I'll just open it up, Lily, by saying I think particularly focusing on recovery and thinking about lessons learned, thinking about developing an evidence base around best practice for recovery. I feel like there's so much focus on mitigation, on response and even relief, and that recovery is sort of left to communities, and there might be a lot of money thrown at them, but there's actually not a lot of understanding as to what does a recovery trajectory look like, when are the best points of time for intervention, for support, and for capacity building. What's your reflection on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that is true across the board, and every recovery is so different. And I think that this is where, at least with my urban planner and an architecture hat on, this is something that I would like to see more involvement in from people in my specific field, and trying to think of where planners can make the largest contribution, because recovery is so long-term. It could take up to 30 years or more for a place to recover. And a lot of that deals with rebuilding not just infrastructure and power lines and actual buildings, but communities and repairing relationships. And in many cases, you know, bringing people home if they've been displaced by that disaster. And so I don't have any kind of solutions, but I will resonate with the fact that it is a challenge that we're experiencing in the places that I work as well. And it is something that we are keeping an eye on as an issue for further development of the field. I do see more questions in the chat. How have you found the best method to dealing with blokes in uniforms? Chris, does this refer to the military and its role in disasters?
So more about emergency services.
Emergency services, okay. So in my experience working response, it was mostly from a data perspective. And so I wasn't necessarily in the field with emergency services personnel. So I don't know that I have the best direct response to this question. I apologize.
Just pretend they're not in uniform, Chris. That's what I find is the best approach. Don't be intimidated by the epaulets and the badges and things.
But I think that is a great maybe segue into another point about emergency management, which is that when something happens, all of these different stakeholder groups converge, not just emergency services and emergency managers, but sometimes the actual military shows up and NGOs descend, and there's so much coordination that needs to happen across these groups and different processes for doing the same exact thing. And there is such a thing as, you know, assessment fatigue experienced by those who have been affected. And so one of the largest challenges is better finding ways to coordinate amongst those groups before anything actually happens and surveys are deployed and damage assessments are done, so that information sharing can happen more efficiently, so that we don't overwhelm the impacted population who are already trying to themselves recover from this traumatic event.
And that comes back to, I think, to developing relationships, you know, across those various organisations and within those various organisations. So just to create those efficiencies and that ease of being able to communicate with one another, and not waiting until a disaster hits and sort of scrambling through processes, but actually knowing who's who.
Right.
Since we're talking challenges, one of the conversations we're having at the Australian Red Cross at the minute, just off the back of some findings through our drought program, is about climate change and sort of the impacts that we can expect in the emergency management sector in the next, 5, 10, 15, 50 years, about how, our workforce is already strapped. We're already stretched pretty thin in a lot of contexts, and under climate change, we can expect disaster to worsen, become more frequent, intensify, be more severe. And so I guess one of the conversations I'm having a lot is how can we leverage our knowledge to adapt now, and like what changes can we make to mitigate? And then also, how can we use our voices as, emergency response, emergency managers to say, we need to make some changes in the way things are being done so that this doesn't intensify to the extent that we can. That's definitely a challenge we're looking at, because it's quite a wicked problem, obviously, but wondering if anybody else is having that conversation.
Yeah, I do think that this is something that is very common across emergency managers. And I guess I kind of have a question back, which is there a platform to which you can elevate this conversation? I know this is a great resource as a forum, but I imagine that, you're not the only one who is asking these questions. And are there others on this call who might want to echo these challenges? And then is there a way to organize and then bring it to light in a different sort of in a different forum so that change can actually happen? It seems like there's an opportunity here to have that conversation more widely and to come up with a solution together that is specific to your region or to Australia. I'm definitely an outsider here since I'm speaking from a US perspective, but I do find that, with these networks of emergency managers in the US, that is a forum that you can take a conversation like this to, IAEM in particular. And in the planning field, there are local chapters or state chapters for the American Planning Association that meet somewhat regularly, and you can elevate these sorts of issues and see if there's some kind of space to work towards a solution or to share solutions that maybe have worked in other places.
That's a really good idea. I guess I've been focusing my attention on trying to drive our leadership to be a bit bolder and braver in dealing with government and, taking an advocacy sort of stance. But I think that's a really good call out to partner with other organizations, and we can amplify one another's voices and findings that way.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I find that especially during COVID and with everyone being remote, some of the more productive sorts of things that I've seen people do from an organizational standpoint is to have these, brown bag lunches or these talks where an organization can invite a guest speaker, very similar to this format, but to focus in on a very specific topic or a problem that you're trying to solve, and have that open up a larger discussion of, what is working and what isn't working, and what are some lessons learned that we can take from this and perhaps apply to the way that we do things. So that might be a good start, just to do some learning and take some useful lessons from other practitioners that are dealing with similar problems.
Great idea, thanks.
Absolutely. And of course, we had the emergency leaders for climate change a couple of years ago. So all of or many of the past emergency management commissioners across the various states and territories of Australia collectively wrote to our Prime Minister and advocated very strongly on action for climate change, directly in relation to increased risks of emergencies and disasters. But I think that was a bit of a one-off rather than a sort of a much more systemic and ongoing kind of a campaign, if you like.
I'll have to look that up, thanks.
Yep, thanks. Isabel.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and just reflect on one of my experiences that I had at one of the recovery forums when in Victoria, would have been, the 2019-20 bushfires. And one of the tensions that kind of came up in that was, there was a lot of discussion in the regional town about climate change and the impacts of climate change. But there was also parts of the community that didn't, well, perhaps, I don't know, try not to say the word believe in climate change, but didn't feel that that was the biggest trigger. And trying to figure out how to have these conversations where you're finding mutual ground to say, we want to be working towards these sort of goals, but not saying climate change necessarily too loudly in some spaces of the community. Have you got any thoughts or reflections on that, Lily?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I'd say that these days, that term is not quite so loaded as it used to be. And I'm kind of bringing back some experience from working with a project called ISEE Change, ISEE change.org, which is a platform for making observations. It's a community platform for making observations and sharing photos of environmental change from a very, very granular community level, at the scale of a sidewalk or a fire hydrant or a seawall or something that is right, or your backyard, essentially. And when this platform was first developed in around 2015, using the word climate change was very challenging. And I was involved with this project in its early stages. And so the team used the word environmental change in some contexts, and found that was better received, and it didn't have the political sort of bent on it, let's say. It is challenging to talk about that term in particular with certain audiences, and particularly with the Pacific Disaster Center, with many of its partners being the Department of Defense. I did find that leadership did shy away from using that explicit term when dealing with certain with certain higher up leadership in the DoD, and it's painful almost. Actually, it is painful as a practitioner and scholar in this field to find that still exists. But it is a reality to deal with in this field, and to be careful with, at least from a communication standpoint, to understand that, you can still move an agenda forward and still implement change and be sensitive to the audience. And this kind of comes back to my communication hat being on. But to, at least for us at the Pacific Disaster Center, be real about the fact that the science is what it is. And we are communicating the science and presenting the actual evidence. And the evidence is attributed to climate change, and that's why there are more storms and more wildfires. So it's kind of a tender dance that gets done, but I do feel that there is more awareness and more acceptance of that term from a very official level, much more so than before. So I think there is progress being made, though we could still be doing better.
Absolutely, we can. And I guess that's why resilience is such a great catch-all kind of a phrase, because we can include all sorts of things under resilience, including climate change and pandemics, bushfire, flood, hurricane, what have you. we have run out of time, unfortunately, and I feel like we were only just getting started and getting into the rhythm of having a really great conversation with Lily, and I'm sorry that I have to bring it to a close. Lily, if I can just say on behalf of the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network and everybody on the call today, thank you so much for making the time, for interrupting your break in Hawaii. I hope you get out to the pool or out into the surf and enjoy some sunshine and some time with your family. Thank you again, and thank you to everybody who has come along today. We will see you next time, and have a great week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, Lily.